Over 10 million people displaced, more than 15,000 civilians confirmed dead, and a continent that spent 30 years cutting its defense budgets is now racing to rebuild them in 3. The war in Ukraine did not just change Ukraine, it changed everything around it, and most of those changes were not in any plan. On February 24, 2022, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The Kremlin's planners expected Kyiv to fall within 72 hours. Russian armored columns moved on the capital from the north. Special forces were sent ahead to seize Hostomel airport and create a landing strip for paratroopers. The assumption was that Ukraine's government would flee, the military would collapse, and the world would adapt to a new reality before it had time to object. That plan failed completely. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky stayed in Kyiv and was filmed on a phone camera on the street outside the presidential office, saying, "We are here, we are defending our country." It became one of the most replayed moments in modern political history. Within days, Russian columns north of Kyiv were stopped, ambushed, and eventually withdrawn. The 72-hour war became a week, a month, a year, and then 3. 3 years on, the front line has shifted but not broken. Russia holds roughly 18% of Ukrainian territory. The fighting has settled into a grinding war of attrition along a front line stretching more than 1,000 kilometers. Neither side has achieved a decisive military victory, but the war has produced decisive changes everywhere else in Europe, in NATO, in the global weapons market, and in how wars are fought. That is what this episode is about. The United Nations has confirmed more than 15,000 civilian deaths since February 2022, with over 41,000 injured. Those are the documented numbers. Independent analysts believe the true figure is significantly higher. Strikes on critical infrastructure, power stations, water systems, heating networks, have left millions without electricity in sub-zero temperatures. During consecutive winters, civilian casualties rose by 26% in 2025 alone. The displacement figure is equally staggering. More than 10 million Ukrainians have left the country since the invasion. The European Union's Temporary Protection Directive has provided over 4 million of them with residence rights, healthcare, and education across member states. Those protections were due to expire in March 2026. The European Commission extended them by 1 year, a recognition that no return timeline is yet realistic. These are not statistics. They are the permanent reshaping of a generation. Russia has also paid an enormous human price. Though its government does not publish accurate figures, Western intelligence assessments estimate Russian military casualties at over 300,000, killed and wounded. Entire units have been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. Russia has sustained its capacity through a combination of forced conscription, prisoner recruitment through the Wagner model, and North Korean troop contributions. A sign of how the war has strained Russian manpower beyond what domestic mobilization alone can cover. The human cost on both sides is irreversible. No peace deal restores the dead, rebuilds the cities, or returns the displaced exactly as they were. Whatever the war's political outcome, that human equation is already settled, and it sits beneath everything else we are about to discuss. 3 days after Russia's full-scale invasion, Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz stood before the Bundestag and announced a €100 billion special fund for the German military. He called it a Zeitenwende, a turning point. Germany, which had a constitutional culture of restraint on military spending and had refused for years to send weapons into conflict zones, reversed both positions within 72 hours of the invasion's start. That single speech rewrote 70 years of German foreign policy. Germany was not alone. Poland increased its defense spending to 4% of GDP, higher than any NATO member, including the United States. Sweden and Finland abandoned decades of military neutrality and joined NATO, Sweden's first alliance membership in over 200 years. The Baltic states tripled their defense budgets. Across Europe, the language shifted overnight. Defense was no longer a bureaucratic line item. It became a survival question, and survival questions get funded. By 2026, European leaders are wargaming, something that would have been unthinkable 3 years ago. What happens if NATO's command and control structure is unavailable? With the United States distracted by Iran, pulling troops from European bases, and openly contemptuous of alliance obligations, France and Germany have set up a nuclear steering group to discuss whether France's nuclear arsenal could serve as a European deterrent. Europe is preparing for its own defense without an American guarantee it can rely on. Putin's strategic goal was to prevent NATO from expanding eastward. The result of his invasion, NATO expanded to include Finland and Sweden, gained a land border with Russia more than 1,300 kilometers long. and now fields the most urgent rearmament program in Europe since the Cold War. That outcome was entirely the product of Russia's own decision. It is the central strategic irony of the entire conflict. Ukraine has changed warfare more fundamentally than any conflict since World War II. The central technology is not a fighter jet or a missile system. It is a drone that costs $300 to $500 and can destroy a tank worth $4 million. Ukrainian forces have deployed cheap commercial and military drones at a scale and sophistication nobody anticipated. Russia has responded with its own drone program. The result is that the entire theory of how armored forces operate has been rewritten inside 3 years. What Ukraine proved is that large armored formations cannot move safely in daylight when the enemy has persistent drone surveillance. Russian tank losses have been staggering, over 3,000 confirmed destroyed by open-source trackers. Ukraine's drone strikes have reached deep inside Russian territory, hitting oil refineries, ammunition depots, and airfields hundreds of kilometers from the front line. For the first time since aerial warfare began, the side without air superiority can still strike strategic targets at scale. Every major military in the world has been watching and recalibrating. The United States has increased funding for drone development for the F-47 program by 65%. Ukraine and the U.S. are in talks about a technology sharing deal allowing Kyiv to export drone technology and partner with American firms on manufacturing. 20 countries are reportedly in drone technology discussions with Ukraine. The Battlefield Laboratory of Ukraine is now licensing its lessons to the world. The drone war is not the only technological shift. Ukraine has also pioneered the use of naval drones, unmanned surface vessels that have struck Russian warships in the Black Sea, including the flagship Moskva. A country with no functioning navy sank a flagship. That is not a footnote. That is a revolution. One of the most consequential changes of the past 3 years has nothing to do with the battlefield. It is the visible cracking of the transatlantic alliance that has been the foundation of Western security since 1949. Under the Trump administration, the United States has drawn down troops from European bases, imposed tariffs on European goods, attempted to coerce Denmark over Greenland, and openly questioned the value of the NATO commitment. Europe's relationship with its principal security guarantor is the most strained it has been since the Suez Crisis of 1956. The United States has also been drawing down financial support for Ukraine, where Washington once led the funding coalition, providing over $100 billion in combined military and economic aid since 2022. The Trump administration has signaled a sustained pullback. Europe has scrambled to fill the gap. The EU attempted to approve a $21.4 billion multi-year military assistance fund. It failed. A NATO 5-year fund of $107 billion was rejected. One-year pledges replaced long-term commitments. The structural fragility is real. Secretary of State Marco Rubio described the upcoming NATO summit in Ankara as probably the most important in NATO's history, warning that fundamental issues need to be fixed. European officials are wargaming Article 42.7 of the EU treaty, the bloc's closest equivalent to NATO's Article 5, as a fallback if the American security guarantee becomes unreliable. Paris and Berlin are discussing the role of French nuclear weapons in Europe-wide deterrence. This is not a theoretical conversation. It is active planning. 3 years ago, European strategic autonomy was a phrase used by French officials that most allies dismissed as rhetorical. Today, it is a structural project with active planning, emergency budgets, and nuclear consultations. Ukraine did not cause this, but the war accelerated a process that may define European security for the next 50 years. The Western sanctions regime imposed on Russia after February 2022 was the largest and fastest in history. Within weeks, over $400 billion in Russian central bank assets held abroad were frozen. Major Western companies exited the Russian market. Russia was cut off from the SWIFT payment system. The expectation in Western capitals was economic collapse within months. That did not happen, and understanding why it did not happen tells you something important about the limits of economic pressure alone. Russia survived through a combination of oil and gas revenues, redirected to India and China, a massive increase in domestic military production, the Iranization of its economy, adapting to sanctions isolation as Iran has done for decades, and a willingness to sacrifice consumer welfare for state war priorities. Inflation rose sharply. Ordinary Russians felt the squeeze. But the government kept the war funded. In 2025, Russia's defense spending reached 40% of its federal budget. That is a war economy. and war economies can sustain punishment for longer than expected. But there are limits. The same analysts who track Russian economic resilience note the Iranization comparison cuts both ways. Iran has survived sanctions for 40 years, but it has not thrived, has not developed, and is now in open military conflict with the United States. A Russia permanently isolated from Western technology, capital, and markets faces a long-term trajectory of decline even if it survives the short term. The question is how long the short term lasts, and what it costs everyone else. Russia is also watching its military capabilities degrade in ways that matter beyond this war. Losing thousands of tanks, hundreds of aircraft, and an entire Black Sea flagship cannot be fully replaced in the medium term. The reputation of Russian military hardware, a global export product, has been publicly tested, and found wanting. That has consequences for Russian arms sales for decades. In February 2026, the United States, Russia, and Ukraine met in Geneva for 2 days of talks. They ended without a breakthrough. Russia's position, presented by hardline negotiator Vladimir Medinsky, was described by observers as closer to a demand for Ukraine's surrender than a basis for compromise. Ukraine has ruled out withdrawing from any territory it still holds. Russia has ruled out withdrawing from any territory it has taken. The gap between those positions is not a negotiating distance. It is a chasm. Security guarantees are the central sticking point. Ukraine has made clear that any ceasefire without credible, binding security guarantees is simply a pause before the next invasion. Europe agrees. Russia has refused to accept any NATO or European force on Ukrainian territory as a condition of peace. The United States offered 15-year security guarantees. Ukraine said it needs more than 20. The Kremlin said any such guarantees cross a red line. 3 parties, 3 irreconcilable positions, and a war continuing while they argue. There have been ceasefire moments. Russia announced a 2-day truce for the World War II anniversary. Ukraine observed it. Russia violated it almost immediately after. A 3-day ceasefire brokered by the United States in early May produced a prisoner exchange, 1,000 each side, before the fighting resumed. These are humanitarian pauses, not peace. Analysts broadly agree that a ceasefire without security guarantees would simply allow both sides to rearm for the next round. The war grinds on because neither side sees an acceptable alternative to grinding on. What is clear is that any peace deal ending this war will require Ukraine to accept some territorial loss, at least temporarily. That is a reality war, weary Ukrainians are slowly, reluctantly, and painfully beginning to accept. What is not clear is whether Russia will accept any deal that leaves Ukraine viable, armed, and moving toward Europe. And that ambiguity is why this war continues. So what has 3 years of war actually changed? Let us be precise. European security has been fundamentally restructured, faster than at any point since the Cold War. 2 new NATO members. Defense budgets doubled or tripled across the continent. A European nuclear conversation that did not exist 3 years ago. A continent that once delegated its security to Washington now building the capacity to manage without it. These are permanent structural changes. They do not reverse when the shooting stops. The technology of warfare has changed. Drones, unmanned surface vessels, and precision strikes by relatively cheap systems against expensive targets. These lessons are now embedded in every major military's planning. The era of invincible armored columns is over. The era of contested airspace managed by cheap autonomous systems has begun. Ukraine did not start this revolution, but Ukraine proved it, at scale, under fire. That proof cannot be undone. Every defense ministry on earth has seen the same footage, and democracy itself has been tested. Ukraine has held together under conditions that would have shattered most states. Zelensky has maintained legitimacy, public trust, and Western support through 3 years that his critics, and Putin, predicted would collapse in months. That is not nothing. It is also not a permanent result. The war continues. Exhaustion is real. And the democratic world's patience for open-ended commitments has limits that are now being tested in real time, simultaneously, across 2 major wars. If this episode helped you understand not just the war, but what the war has permanently altered, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every week we step back from the noise and find the signal, because the story of Ukraine is not just the story of Ukraine. It is the story of what happens when a world order is tested, and nobody is completely sure it will hold. The story doesn't end here, it evolves. And so must we.